let's get into a very important question, which is whether the 2007 agreement, the restoration community between the MP and ROCOR, whether it invalidated earlier synodical actions of ROCOR, such as the 1983 condemnation of ecumenism. I'm going to quote something from someone in the audience. Someone else could tell me whether this is an accurate quote. It says, acts issued previously which preclude the fullness of canonical communion are hereby deemed invalid or obsolete. So I'm going to pose this to Father John because he's in ROCOR. Is it your understanding in 2007 when communion was attained between MP and ROCOR that this agreement, like the quotation we're seeing here, did it invalidate earlier synodical actions, or is that an inaccurate synopsis of what that means and what they were trying to accomplish in 2007?
It was, that statement was in there because of things like maybe deposing clergy that went from one jurisdiction to the other and things like that. But it wasn't related to the anathema against ecumenism, because the anathema against ecumenism didn't specifically condemn any local church. It just said that if anybody teaches these things, let them be anathema. But basically there were three issues that that ROCOR was concerned about before it would consider reconciling with the Moscow Patriarchate. Well, four, I guess, if you count number one, they had to no longer be under Soviet authority. Number two, they had to condemn ecumenism, and number three, they had to condemn sergianism, and number four, they had to glorify the new martyrs. And in 2000, they did all those things. Now, when they condemned sergianism, they didn't say we condemn Metropolitan Sergius to hell. But if you read their statement on the relationship between church and state, they condemned what we define as sergianism. And they also, in their document about the relationship with the non-Orthodox, they condemned ecumenism as we understood it. So basically, that's when it was after that council that the question of reconciling with the Moscow Patriarchate became a hot issue. And if you don't want to talk about this just yet, I can defer it. But in ROCOR, prior to the collapse of communism, you had people with various views. Some people who took very extreme views against the Moscow Patriarchate, some who did not. But the Synod as a whole never condemned the Moscow Patriarchate. We never said they're graceless heretics or anything like that. And the reverse is also true. The Moscow Patriarchate never condemned ROCOR. And actually in the 1990s, if they had chosen to condemn ROCOR as schismatics, I think most of the rest of the Orthodox Church would have just assumed that that was a authoritative statement. So the fact that they didn't was showing that they wanted to reconcile. And also we had always talked about that the day would come when we would reconcile. It's just that some people didn't agree whether that day had come or not. But those were basically the issues, and that was the moment when it started to change. And so when the closer we got to that, that's when these differences within ROCOR started to bubble to the surface. Because as long as the Soviets were in charge, we could all agree, hey, whatever you think about the Moscow Patriarchate, we can't come under them because the Soviets would manipulate us through them. It was only after that things started, these differences started to come to the fore.
Now, before, and because we really need Father Joseph's insight on this, so I'm going to add one thing. I'm going to push back a tiny bit, and just on the nature of the Russian Church today, right, since the Ukraine war and everything, and just the realities of Putinist Russia. Are we sort of seeing like a sort of neo-sergianism or crypto-sergianism in Russia? Because what I have to say, knowing Moscow Patriarch priests, is if they got family in Russia, they will not dare say anything about any political policy in Russia because they're afraid of retaliation in Russia. And they're obviously not happy about it. And,
well, the thing is, you have to understand what sergianism is and what it isn't.
Okay, so please explain.
Sergianism does not mean that the Orthodox Church cooperates with the government on some level, or that it might not even be manipulated in some way by the government. what sergianism is defending or lying about the persecution of the church by the state and cooperating with it on some level in a way that facilitates that persecution. And I think in some of the criticism towards the Moscow Patriarchate, beginning with Metropolitan Sergius, I think was not entirely fair. But certainly there were times when they just openly lied about what was going on in Russia. They would say that there's no persecution of the church in Russia or in the Soviet Union. Well, that was a lie, and that was wrong. And in the year 2000, the Russian church, in their statement about the relationship between church and state, said that you can't lie about that kind of stuff, and you certainly can't cooperate with the government in a way that facilitates persecution.
Thank you, Father John. Now, on purpose, because I know Father Joseph is ready to pounce on so many different things, I'm purposely going to reverse ask the same question back so we can then kind of cover all this thing right over again from your perspective, Father Joseph. Did the 2007 agreement between ROCOR and Moscow Patriarchate invalidate earlier synodical actions such as the 1983 condemnation of ecumenism?
Well, I'm going to have to go on this from a couple of different levels because there were a couple of things that I need to address in the previous statement. But the first one would be yes.
But first, please answer the question.
Right.
But
that's what I'm going to do. In the first place, yes. This is part of the reason why we have the video depositions of Bishop, now Archbishop Gabriel, for example, saying that the anathema against ecumenism was no longer valid. There's other issues at play
and to define our ears, Gabriel and ROCOR.
Correct. That's on YouTube. That's not. I'm not making that up.
Well, we still read that anathema from the Synodicon on the Sunday of Orthodoxy,
and a lot of people
which is also true. Yes,
but the reason I'm bringing this up is not to kind of do a gotcha on Father John. It's because of the fact that at that time, I'm simply trying to point out that contemporary authorities, not all of them obviously, but some of them, understood that particular line about everything in disagreement being null and void as to be literally null and void. So I'm not saying that was a universal. I do recognize that just a few years later, you saw the anathema against ecumenism, the second anathema, and all the other things on the Jordan Will website. I'm the first to admit that. But what I would say is that the question of whether they considered it binding had changed somewhat. To go a little bit further, I agree with Father John's definition of sergianism, except I would add that it's not simply lying, but it comes down to submission to Antichrist governments. And what I mean by that is either Antichrist submissions or submission to Antichrist governments. But the whole point is that you're talking about submission to evil in a way a Christian cannot do by conscience. And so, yes, Sergius did lie about the situation of the church out when he was outside Russia. But inside Russia, he was also assisting in the facilitation of the imprisonment and torture of Orthodox Christians. The most famous case I remember is that of Ivan M. Andreev, who was part of the St. Petersburg delegation that met with Sergius when they were asking what could be done to stop the persecutions, and he literally looked at the face of people suffering in the face of the Soviets and said, what persecutions are there here? So the point is, it's not even just dishonesty to the rest of the world. He was a traitor to his own people, his own Orthodox people. And so that's, I think, where I'd go with that for now. But just if you want to follow up.
And so to review, it sounds like you agree that the definition of sergianism that Father John gave is correct. You agree that in 2007 explicitly did not invalidate what the anathema of 1983, but due to certain bishops believing it did as such, it kind of leaves that an open question. Is that an accurate way of understanding what
I would say that what it means is that the answer given that the 2007 statement was only referring to things like depositions, etc., because we're contemporaries of the period, was
Yes.
not the way people as a whole understood it. Maybe some did, but other people understood it as the anathema against ecumenism is no more. And I will add that there were people who were actually celebrating that.
I don't
Now,
know
let
of
me ask-
anybody.
okay.
I don't remember anybody talking about, hey, we're going to the Moscow Patriarchate, and this means that we're invalidating the anathema against ecumenism. I
me
don't
ask
think
you-
anybody saw that as a change of our stance on ecumenism.
Well, I mean, I remember when Bishop Jerome, and I don't want to sound like I'm jumping here, but remember he was Father John Shaw back then in the days with all those email lists, and he loved saying Father Panteleimon authored the anathema against ecumenism. It was never really the Russian bishop. Do you remember that?
Well, that Bishop Jerome has always said that, and he continues to say that. But the thing is, his point is he didn't believe that it actually was part of the original minutes of that meeting. But the thing is, whether it really was or not, it certainly was used in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy after that. So it really doesn't matter how it came into being.
Let's talk
It
about
was
that,
being
though.
affirmed. But the thing is, it's still being affirmed. If we believe that our going into communion with the Moscow Patriarchate ended that, we wouldn't continue to say it.
It's I'll say it on a personal note. I've met Bishop Jerome because he's actually the Hermitage of the Lady of Kursk in Mayapack, New York. I grew up in Mayapack, New York.
Oh,
So it's just one of those random things. I actually met Bishop Jerome there, going to a Saturday liturgy. But that being said, it's we see this claim here. Compare the anathema they read today to the anathema of 1983. I'm inferring that is the anathema has been changed.
it was in the 2000s.
Is there some intentional change, or is there some confusion as to what was published, what wasn't? What are we really dealing with here? Let me give you both guys a opportunity to respond to this.
If there is a change, it's a very subtle one. It doesn't really change the substance of it. I wasn't aware that there was any difference in the wording.
And Father Joseph, what kind of difference is there then?
Okay, well, first off, I'm going to explain what was the change in a generality, and then I'll explain how it was presented by different people. The change occurred, I believe, I want to say around 2002 to 2003. It was right after the schism of Metropolitan Vitaly. It was done at Synod headquarters, and basically it changed the anathema from one that was relatively short to one that was about 2 paragraphs long. It added things like Freemasonry, so on and so forth. So it was originally pitched as, and nobody understood why, and until you took it apart, pitched as something positive, that we were anathematizing all sorts of ecumenists, we were anathematizing the syncretists and the Masons, so on and so forth. But it wasn't until I did this, and apparently I wasn't the first person to do this, started comparing them side by side. The one thing that the anathema of 1983, which is shorter, contains, that the anathema of 2002 or 2003 doesn't contain, is or those who participate with them. Like, that's gone in the second one. So in theory, the second anathema actually, while it is broader, actually does not condemn those who can celebrate with, say, ecumenists. So it's actually more useful that way. But again,
so your argument is the change that was made was deliberate, so that way they could kind of have their cake and eat it too. They could say we're against the we're against the ecumenists, but we're not going to condemn those that are not against the ecumenists, something like that.
Exactly. Right, but it was because they added so much stuff to it. It was a very subtle bait and switch. Even HTM in their analysis of it didn't notice it. So, but it's not until you look at it side by side and you realize that.
I'll say 2 comments on this. One, I'll pay special careful attention in the Synodicon this year during Lent. And the second thing is, even, I will say, historically speaking, with things like even the Constantinopolitan Creed, we do find subtle manuscript differences where eventually a given textual variant gets precedent, and that's what we know as the creed. I have no idea if there's something like this here. It's an interesting historical question.
Oh no,
anyway.
This isn't a textual variant. This was an actual official change. If you look at Jordan,
okay, so it's a deliberate change in 2003.
It's an official change. Yeah.
Okay.
That's not That's not.
Well, the thing I would say about that though is if Father Joseph is suggesting that the original canon or the original anathema had the sort of cootie view of an anathema, where if you are anathema, then anybody that you are serving with gets the cooties, and then anyone they serve with gets the cooties. that's a wrong way of understanding anathemas and canonical penalties anyway. St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain specifically says that an anathema has to be directed at somebody specifically to be effective. Otherwise, it's a warning. And the original anathema was not, it didn't pin the tail on the heretic. It just said, if you do this, anathema. But that's a warning when you don't say, so-and-so did this and he's anathema. Those are two very different statements.
Well, okay, first off, I do want to clarify, Father, with all due respect, I was not trying to imply that one anathema was better than the other. I was simply noting the differences between the texts.
Okay.
On a second point, I would say that while, yes, one could argue this cootie thing, I guess you're saying, but the idea that co-laborers with heretics weren't condemned, you find that in the Third Ecumenical Council, you find that in the Fifth Ecumenical Council. People who worked with Vigilius were anathematized, people who worked with Nestorius were anathematized. I mean, co-workers of heretics have often been labeled as heretics.
Well, when you say co-workers of heretics, that would be people who are actually promoting the heresy, whereas when you're talking about people who remain in communion with somebody, most of the Orthodox Church remained in communion with Rome after 1054 for a century or two before they actually broke communion. And you have a lot of examples like this where some people broke communion with a particular group, but other people did not. And I'm not aware of any case where the church said, because you remained in communion with this group after such and such date, you're therefore condemned. It was always based on what you taught.
Well, I mean, I tend to think, well, when we're talking about the Rome example, it gets a little bit complicated because of the fact that there were times in different sees where they didn't know if another bishop was alive. They would commemorate a bishop 20 years after his death. But in the case of Rome, the change was so radical, and I think Craig covers the whole basics of that in his latest book. But ultimately, with Hildebrand, you have a civil war occurring throughout Western Europe. Most of the Eastern Church had no idea what was going on, and they were just like, okay, who's the Pope? But they didn't even commemorate him or not. They just stopped around 1014 because they stopped keeping track for some reason, and by the time they started again, that's when we get to
we're getting a little off topic.
Yeah, I'm sorry.